Well, that's 6 o'clock, but we typically have Ed and a couple of others on. So give me just 3 shakes of a lamb's tail here, and I'm going to check my email and see. Okay, and there we go. Doug said he wouldn't be able to make it, and Ed might just be running a little bit late. And these are recorded, so he might just be waiting for the recorded version to come out, which is nice to be able to sit back in the comfort of your own living room, flip on the old smart TV or pull it up on your phone or tablet and be able to listen and watch in your own time. I think we are going to go ahead and get started though. And I think we're ready to rock. Okay, welcome everyone. Any newbies that might be joining us, don't worry, all of our sessions have been recorded and they can be found on the Iowa Nut Growers YouTube page. So you can check that out for all of our sessions. We're at session 4 here. So we're going to continue learning about hazelnuts, specifically planting and maintenance. But in addition, we're going to start filling in that enterprise worksheet to get an idea of the overall costs associated with establishing 1 acre of hybrid hazelnuts. And let's be able to move my slide here. There we go. If you were with us last week, you heard me say the word goal about 100 times. Well, you're going to hear it again this session. So what is the goal? If we ask that question in relation to the session we're participating in now, here's what I hope you come away with. So I hope you come away with a better understanding of plants per acre and planting density, the various planting methods depending on your rootstock, flagging and site layout, any maintenance needs, and then some possible solutions. So think of things like landscape fabric, mulch, tree tube, stuff like that. And then finally, just a little bit about pruning. So as we look at our enterprise worksheet, I want to spend just a little time talking through some of the assumptions that are laid out in the top left-hand corner there, you can see. So for context, this was completed about a decade ago and much has changed since then. But we still don't have a sense for ideal plant spacing and density. It is looking more and more like higher plant densities than initially thought, but ultimately it depends on your goal. So for example, if you're looking to implement an alley cropping setting, maybe with really wide rows to crop annuals or forages, planting densities are less important. Maybe a silvopasture system might be similar, with less emphasis placed on maybe packing in the number of seedlings to reduce that unproductive space, and then instead focusing on managing the forages as shading increases with time. So that'd be a silvopasture system. But if we're looking at the assumptions that were made for this enterprise worksheet, we looked at a spacing of 15 feet between rows and then 5 feet between plants within the row. Now, a handy chart that I Googled and downloaded is right here. It shows the approximate number of plants per acre based on the spacing between plants within row and then the spacing between rows of plants. So a spacing of 5 feet between plants, 15 feet between rows equates to approximately 580 plants per acre. Now, remember, this is assuming a full acre of plants. If you're growing only 1 acre and then doing like mechanical harvesting, your site layout will need to include a minimum of 40 feet at the end of each row for the mechanical harvester just to be able to turn around. And that would be on both ends. So roughly 80 feet of each row would not have hazelnuts planted to them, which would impact your overall numbers. Thus, every enterprise worksheet is going to be different for every grower given their particular situation and layout. Now, real quick, I mentioned I put together this worksheet about a decade ago, and for comparison, A more recent publication that Jason Fishbach, Ag Extension Agent with Bayfield County up in northern Wisconsin, he put together a document, and you should all find this on the MidwestHazelnuts.org website. Excuse me, but he looks at a spacing of 4 feet between plants and then 12 feet between rows for total plant density of just over 900 plants per acre. Incidentally, this is also why I set up this enterprise worksheet with ranges in most categories, because it really is going to be all over the place depending on plant densities and overall site layout, not to mention the cost of plants. So back to the worksheet. The other assumption I wanted to point out that will be relevant later on is the linear feet. And this simply refers to the total linear feet of the planting. And it comes into play when we start talking about irrigation and weed barriers and things like that. So we're assuming 2,899 linear feet. And then real quickly, the other assumptions that we won't get into tonight, but they include a yield of 2 pounds of in-shell nuts per plant, and then a price paid to growers of $1 per pound, and then a paid labor rate of $10 an hour. Okay, plant material. This is going to be our first cost to write down. And if we use the assumptions presented here, we're looking at 580 plants per acre. And of course, that can go higher depending on what the eventual research reveals is maybe that sweet spot for profitability. So then what is the cost of plants? Well, this is going to vary depending on what you're purchasing. Are we looking at bare root dormant, standard 4x4 liners, maybe potted plants? So for reference, the cost of the last batch of 4x4 liners I received from Great Plains was $8 to $9.50 per plant. This was the Beast and the Grand Traverse. Plants from Grimo Nut Nursery, the Aldaras, the Marion, the Franks, the Northern Blaze, all those, they're roughly $13 to $18 per plant, coming as bare root dormant seedlings. But keep in mind that those are actually shipped from Canada. And so they're going to have the added cost of being international. So the added fees at the border that Grimo takes care of, by the way, completely, which is nice. Ultimately, once we've identified some worthy genotypes that can be replicated, the hope is that the cost would eventually come down once we have nurseries kicking out, maybe thousands of these liners. But at this stage of the game, we're really looking at plants that I would conservatively peg at maybe $10 a plant. Certainly, a goal is going to be to try to reduce and get that down to $5 or less, perhaps. And maybe that's the range that's appropriate. $5 per plant eventually, and at the low end of plants now, $10 per plant at the midpoint, and then probably $15 or so at the high end of the spectrum. And if you think about it, that spread makes a huge difference. Combined with the number of plants per acre, now you start to understand why I listed financing as a real obstacle in my previous presentation. Once we have productive plants to scale up, we need to figure out how we're going to be able to finance even an acre, let alone 2, 5, or 10. Incidentally, my father was a loan officer and vice president of a local ag lending bank. And when I showed him numbers like these many years ago, he basically just shook his head. And so remember also that we're talking about hybrid hazelnut cultivars. So if growers wanted to use like open pollinated seedlings for an agroforestry practice that maybe wasn't focused on production, or to add some pollen producing shrubs to the cultivar mix, then we'd be looking at maybe a range of $1 per plant up to $5 or more that some growers are charging. So okay, I filled in the range based on 580 plants per acre, a low end of $5 per plant, and a high end of $15 per plant. And of course, my simple country math makes $10 an average and a nice round number in the middle. So it's simple enough to multiply our number of plants times the $10 cost, and we get $5,800 as a midpoint cost per acre for plants. And again, that's just for plants. Okay, let's talk about site prep. This is going to be our next cost to account for, and this might include things like tillage if it's needed, or any chemical burn down to kill the existing turf grass or forage mix or pasture or whatever it is. In essence, it's any cost that's going to be associated with preparing the site for planting. Now, keep in mind, this might vary greatly, and it also might be dependent on what you choose for weed barrier or weed management. But maybe more on that in just a second here. So if you saw last week's presentation, you might have seen this already, but this was a planting that we did. Gave my father a reason to get out the old Alice Chalmers 3-bottom plow. um, and there is a young man thinking about how many millions of dollars he's going to make growing hazelnuts in Iowa. Yes. Okay, that was fun. So let's talk about weed barrier because competition. Competition from sod forming grass, it's a real killer of trees and shrubs. So weed management is a must. That we need to have a weed management plan. We have many options. This can be done in a lot of different ways. Regardless of what we end up choosing, we need to allocate a cost for it in our enterprise worksheet here. And so mulch. Simple wood chips or mulch can be used, like in the picture here. Of course, if we're going to use that, make sure we're laying it thick, 4 to 6 inches, a good 12 to 18 inches kind of around the plant. And then the need to come back in subsequent years and reapply some of that mulch. Weed barrier, you can see on the left there, landscape fabric, it can be used alone or in conjunction with the wood chip mulch. I like it in conjunction. I'm actually going to talk more about this a little bit later when how we've used the landscape fabric in some of our plantings, some pros and cons of using it, and then my thoughts overall. So just hold tight for now, and we'll come back to that. Irrigation is recommended for at least the first 2 years of establishment. Trees and shrubs need at least 1 inch of rain per week from Mother Nature or us humans. And so 1 inch of rain is roughly 5 to 7 gallons. Again, this can be provided in many different ways, from a drip irrigation system to buckets with holes in the side of the bucket, kind of towards the bottom there. I've used both methods and they both work well. They have their trade-offs. Ultimately, access to water is really going to dictate how you water your planting. In this particular scenario that we're outlining here, we're looking at a cost of 20 to 50 cents per linear foot for a range of $580 per acre to over $1,400 per acre. I'll share some specifics on how we water the Struker joint performance trial later in the talk. It's been a challenge the last 2 years with this area of Iowa in a fairly severe drought. It was worse in 2021, but we still had some really dry conditions in 2022 as well. So watering every week has been a necessity in 2021. It did let up a little bit last year, but still really dry here. Tree tubes. These are a little controversial for some. People ask if they're really necessary, and the answer really depends on personal, well, it's just going to depend on how you feel about using them. My experience is I've found them to be very helpful. I use them where appropriate on our plantings because hazelnuts, they don't need a full 5-foot tree tube. We typically end up cutting a standard 5-footer into 2 pieces, which helps to keep the cost down. But you don't need that full 5 feet. I mean, these are going to be multi-stemmed shrubs, so you just want to protect them the first couple of years, give them a nice environment to get up and growing. Also, if buying in bulk can make a real difference compared to buying in retail. So the range for this particular cost is $870 per acre up to $2,600 per acre. You can see quite the range. Of course, if you're going to use the tree tubes, you're going to need the tree stakes. We use simple fencing stakes for the do-it-yourself electric fences. They can be purchased from just about any farm supply store. They come in kind of 2 varieties. Maybe I think of it as the heavier duty rebar and then the thinner smooth metal rod. They both have that little triangle fin welded to the bottom to keep it in place, but they range in price from, excuse me, $1.25 up to $2.50 each. Well, planting costs, just what the name implies, this is going to be the actual cost to put the plants in the ground. And this is going to vary pretty widely depending on what type of plant material you have. For example, standard liners that maybe allow you to use a tree transplanter, they're going to have significantly less labor than the large bare root plants that need to have a hole dug for each plant. And if you think at over 580 to maybe 900 plants per acre, that is a lot of holes to dig. So one of the other things I did was I included the cost of a soil test here because I think that's something that's highly recommended long before plants are ever put in the ground, but still I consider it kind of a component of the establishment costs. So tally up all of our establishment expenses, and we get a range of 6,700 on the low end, up to almost 19,000 on the high end. Again, just a reminder, this is just the establishment cost, the upfront cost to get these seedlings going, regardless if they ever produce a nut. So in my mind, this certainly is going to fall within that realm of a high value specialty crop, and that's how we should be thinking of it. Okay, moving along from the establishment costs to the labor and maintenance costs. We include all sorts of things in this section. Certainly a rent payment to the landowner, whether that's you, a family member, the landlord, it's paid to someone, and so it needs to be included. Need to wet my whistle there. Again, you can see I put a soil test in this section after establishment because it's something that I think really should be done at least every 3 years. It cost me roughly $75 to get a soil test with recommendations. You might be asking how agronomists in the Midwest know what sort of recommendations to make for hazelnuts since it is such a new crop. And that's a really great question. So basically, we use apples as a surrogate, and recommendations can be made based on what will be recommended for apples. It's not ideal, and I get that, but it is something. And then, of course, there are recommendations and information out there for the European hazelnuts out of Oregon and some of those publications that could also be used as a reference. Okay, so moving on, next we have mowing, which we're estimating at 6 to 12 times per growing season, depending on the weather and your preference for the height of grass. If you want it to look like a golf course, well, it's going to mean you mow more. Then we need weed control, and here we're assuming maybe some spraying with some glyphosate weed killer to keep things in check, perhaps. Of course, hand weeding is an option as well if we want to be more organic and not utilize some of those other chemical options. Either way, it needs to be accounted for. We also need to account for replacing some of the seedlings that might die. And I'm sure we're all excellent growers and would not let even a single seedling die, but reality is much different, and a range of different things can lead to seedlings dying. So we just will need to get in there and replace any dead seedlings. So we're assuming up to a 10% replacement ratio there. Fertilizer also assumed at $100 per acre, but I got to admit, this is one of the areas I don't have much experience with, and an area that we might find out later on is really important and way more expensive than we thought. But at this stage of the game, this is where we're at. So once again, we tally up all those costs, and we get a range of $735 to almost $1,900 per acre in ongoing maintenance and labor costs. These are some numbers that shock people sometimes. And remember, this is assuming a planting density of roughly 580 plants per acre. We may find out that it's best to bump up those densities and plant the rows closer together, plants a little closer to one another, which are only going to make these costs go up. So sobering? Yes, I think so. But don't let it discourage you either. We just need to find a way to make it cash flow. And I think we can. Okay, enough with the numbers for a little bit. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of planting and maybe some maintenance and what you need to know. Real quick, before planting, there's a couple of things I want to highlight that I feel are worth mentioning in a presentation like this. And they include record keeping, flagging, receiving and holding plants, and then what to do in the alleyways between rows of shrubs. Uh, please do me a favor and figure out some method of record keeping, whether it's a folder, a binder, a hanging folder, and a filing cabinet, whatever it is, please just get something that's going to allow you to keep track of some basic documents. Then once you have something, get it organized so you can continually add to it as the orchard grows and begins to produce nuts. Equally important is developing a map of where and what is planted. This is the one thing I'm going to harp on and simply tell you that's important. This is important. Furthermore, your map should evolve over time as things change, new information is learned, and then having both hard copies to work from in the field and then, of course, electronic copies that you can manipulate are definitely going to be recommended for any serious grower. Again, this is important. I'm just going to say it, make it explicit. I didn't do a quiz today, but if I was doing a quiz, this would be a quiz question. This is important. Okay. So this is what the map of the Struker Joint Performance Trial near Fenton, Iowa looks like. It contains where each experimental genotype is planted and notes about the condition of the plant. You can see in this slide, the map only has 5 rows. However, the map has been expanded because the joint performance trial now has 7 rows in total. So develop your maps with the ability to be expanded. With a good map, you can be ready to plant new seedlings and add to your orchard, keeping track of where new plants need to be established. And that's what this photo here is depicting as we establish some additional plants to the Del Lawrence Joint Performance Trial down by Marion. Okay, next I want to highlight something that's really often overlooked or a new experience for some growers, and they might not know what to do. So when you receive plants that are shipped to you in the mail or UPS, FedEx, whatever, in the short term, get them out of the shipping box. Get them in water, and please don't forget about them. Ideally, you would receive the seedlings and have them planted a few hours later. But holding them in a tub of water in the interim is going to be acceptable. Long term, if you simply can't get them planted, then consider gravel or mulch beds that could be deployed to grow nice fibrous roots while giving you additional time to get the planting site ready. And here we got a nice little short video. You could also heal the plants in, meaning you plant them in an area with the understanding that you're going to come back to them at a later time, maybe dig them up and then put them in their final planting location. And sometimes it's actually necessary to keep them healed in or in a gravel bed over winter. And in these cases, you really need to be mindful of things like rabbits or other critters that might feast on the buds during the long, cold days of winter. And then it's certainly recommended that you cage or fence the area where you're holding the plants to keep out the rabbits and stuff. And this winter has been brutal for me because I've caged all of my gravel bed areas, but the snow came through and actually wind drifted up, and so I didn't see it. And sure enough, the rabbits were able to just hop up on top of the snowdrift, which had snow drifted up and over the top of the fence, got into an area where just a few of the hazelnut seedlings were exposed. All the rest were completely buried, and they started to munch on them and girdle them. And so I had to go and get the shovel out and essentially remove that snow where it had drifted up against the fence to make a break there. But man, one of those things where we just got a ton of snow this year, and that was the result. You can see these lovely, huge fibrous root systems. This is from Grimo's Nut Nursery up there in, no, where is this from? These might be plants from Lois Brown at the University of Minnesota. But you can see those roots, huge, real nice. And you can imagine the hole that we need to dig for those as well. Okay. So here's what we do when we're planting. We keep the seedlings buried in some moist mulch, and then we remove individual seedlings once we have the hole dug, and then we're ready to plant. Okay, so if you grow hazelnuts, you're going to need to figure out what to plant in between the rows of shrubs. Many options exist, with some growers electing to grow vegetables, maybe even between the rows. In an alley cropping system, wide rows of hazelnuts mean that annual row crops could be grown on the same fields as hazelnuts, providing some short-term revenue while the shrubs grow and produce. Cover crops are another option, and one in particular that it's recommended by Tom Wall at Red Fern Farm is, well, none other than the Tom Wall mix. And it consists of a 45% creeping red fescue, 45% turf perennial ryegrass, and then 10% Dutch white clover. And it's a nice middle of the road mix that won't choke out your shrubs. And so that's one that is recommended. And you can find that. Where can you find that? I need to put that in the notes. Okay, finally we get to planting. And enough with all of this planning talk. Let's get some seedlings in the ground. So the first thing we have to understand is that the planting method will more or less be dictated by the plants you have. For example, these potted plants or these huge bare root dormant plants will have to have a hole dug that can accommodate their roots. And generally speaking, we don't want to trim the roots to make it fit into the hole. We want to make the hole so that it can accommodate all of the roots. Now we contrast that with the large pots and the bare root dormant plants to these more standard liners that might be in a 4-inch banded pot. And these are going to have roots contained within the container, but they're conducive to tree transplanters or other quick and easy methods of planting. Got a little video here. So one of the things that we'll sometimes do just to make things a little cleaner, a little easier, is we'll scalp down the site with the weed trimmer here. Now this is a weed trimmer that has the head on it has 3 plastic blades that are going to be able to handle that sort of treatment and really getting down and scalping things right down to the ground there. Maybe your standard weed trimmer would break off or cause problems, but this one again has those plastic blades. They can be replaced once they get down to just a nubbin, and certainly over time they do wear down just to a little nubbin, but they are pretty effective in again getting that ground just kind of scalped all the way down to the ground, so it's nice bare dirt to dig that hole into. Then of course we need to be sure that we're getting our planting width correct, or the space between plants. So we get the tape measure out and be sure that we get everything in straight lines within the rows there, so that it's easy for mowing and maintenance and stuff like that. Okay, so what about planting? Well, as I mentioned, we want to be sure that we are digging the hole to fit the plants. And so in this particular case, we are planting into the sugar joint performance trial. And this is sometime in late fall here. I want to say it's the early part of November. And we want to go ahead and dig that hole. You can see that we dug it big enough so that it can accommodate the plant. We don't want to get it too terribly deep. We want to have it growing right about the level that it needs to be. If we do have a broken or a damaged root, which can sometimes happen, we do want to get that removed so that it's a nice clean cut and that it can regrow some roots. Here we're a little bit deep yet, so we're going to put some dirt back in there so that we can get it at the proper depth. get that tag up and out of the way. And again, we just check the depth by putting that stake across there as a level, and it needs just a little bit more. But you can imagine trying to do this if we're looking at densities of 580 plants to 900 plants. This can be a pretty laborious system, but it's sometimes what's needed. We've also gone to, for the most part, planting our seedlings in the spring. Um, Getting to be late October into November. This doesn't give a whole lot of time for this plant to get settled and even growing. And so anymore, we'll take seedlings that we might get in the fall, and we'll just heel them into a hole and then get them pulled out in the spring and planted in the final spot out in the field. So this is something that I think is worth talking about just a little bit, because this is a handy dandy unit I mentioned. My brother-in-law is a steel dealer. This is a little 4-inch auger, and this little guy can do amazing things with these plants that come as 4-inch banded pots. And so we're going to show just how slick we can go along when we have lots of plants to plant. We have a flag where we want to place them. One worker can pull that flag. The other worker can just get the hole dug there. We want to be sure that we get the depth right. It's important that we get the depth right. And you can see the worker's got the plant in his hand there so that we can test that depth. Because we don't want to go too deep. There have been plenty of cases where the hole has been dug too deep. The plant slips in there. It's looking nice, but then the dirt settles, the plant drops about an inch or two, and then of course the whole thing is planted too deep. But you can see it does a pretty good job of making a nice little hole there for these 4-inch banded pots, whether they're 9 inches deep, whether they're 4 inches deep, and you can really go to town in terms of getting a lot of plants knocked out with that little drill there. It does have, you can see me pick it up from time to time. It has a bit on the end of it. And so that bit will get clogged up with a little piece of sod or grass from time to time. And so you got to pull off that little clod that gets caught up in that bit, because otherwise it won't cut very well and it just kind of sits there. That's maybe one of the small drawbacks to it, but highly effective and really allows you to get a lot of plants put in a day. And you can see Dell in the background there putting out the landscape fabric pieces there. Yep. Okay. So we're going to contrast this. Oh, here we go. So here's a scenario where, again, we're back at the Struker joint performance trial, putting in some replacement plants. You can see the mulch in the background there around some of those plants. We put it on pretty thick because we think it's valuable to have. We don't have any protection from the north and the west, and so it gets pretty chilly through there. And we've had quite a bit of dieback, and so we've really learned to pile on the wood chips plenty thick. Um, Here you can see some of these big, beautiful plants that come from Great Plains Nursery. Really nice looking. That's a Beast and all. No, Beast and a Grand Traverse are the two varieties coming out of there. And we backfill. We'll put down the piece of landscape fabric right over the top of that. Then you can see a lot of the plants also have some what looks to be been sprayed with just a little bit of glyphosate. And so we'll do that right around the edges of the mulch from time to time, because of course we can't get right up next to that with the lawnmower. And so you'll get just a few of the weeds that'll come up right on the edge there. And so from time to time, we'll just zip that with a little bit of Roundup. And there you can see the tree tube going on. Getting it put in place and protecting that seedling from the wind. We have plenty of wind that rolls through here, and you can see in the background, way in the background behind the corn, there is a huge wind field with about, I want to say 50 or 60 wind turbines back up in there. So this is an area that's got plenty of wind, and those tree tubes really help within that regard. Okay. Well, maintenance in the orchard is pretty straightforward with one goal. Don't let them die. Okay, so let's talk about watering. Watering is crucial the first 2 years of establishment. And again, they need approximately 1 inch of rain or 5 to 10 gallons of water weekly. Keep in mind that another great benefit of mulch is it keeps the soil covered so it doesn't dry out, which means more moisture for growing roots. And the method of watering can be via irrigation, like the drip tape irrigation. It can be the 5 gallon bucket method. Actually, for me, it's a 7 gallon bucket method. And yeah, I'll show you just a little bit here. First, though, I want to give you an example of what conditions would be like if we didn't water. And so these are some of the cracks in the soil from the drought conditions. And again, tough, tough, tough. If we weren't supplementing this planting with some water, things are just real dry here. These soils, incidentally, are really heavy soils, indicative of the prairie pothole region, but the drought conditions have just been something else. And so at this particular joint performance trial here at the Struker joint performance trial, we utilize a 500-gallon water tank, and we're bringing water to the site. You can see that group of trees in the foreground is actually the acreage there. And then we utilize these yellow 7 gallon buckets, and we put them right next to the plant. You can see we've hit each of those with a little bit of Roundup before we put down the mulch. And there we go. And it just kind of comes out. Again, we want to put that hole not on the bottom of the bucket, but on the side of the bucket towards the bottom. And then, of course, a lot of folks will ask, well, how do you keep the bucket from blowing away? And the answer there is we just put a rock inside of it. Now, this is some of that drip irrigation with the hard plastic, not the slits, but the hard plastic within the emitters. And so this is a gravel bed, and you can see those emit. Now you can get those emitters so that they're anywhere from, I think, a half a gallon up to maybe even 2 gallons um, per hour. The different types of emitters. I think these are just the half gallons. And then you can place them just about anywhere you want. And then you can also put little spaghetti tubes on them. And so you can kind of direct the water. If you don't have an emitter that's right next to a seedling, you can give yourself an extra maybe, oh, I don't know, 6 to 8 inches to get that water where you need it to be. Okay, weed control. So the real question is why, and that's easy because the worst thing that you can have for trees and shrubs is sod forming grass. Weeds, button weeds, velvet leaf, well, the same thing. What am I talking about? Lamb's quarters, water hemp, any of those things are better than that grass, that sod. They compete for water. So if you can control sod forming grasses and weeds, you can reduce the need for watering. And then the methods are all over the place, from the mulch, the landscape fabric, mowing, to chemical control with maybe some glyphosate or something like that. Here we have landscape fabric or weed barrier, very effective. We can cut this into squares essentially to place around each plant. But more recently, I'm interested in trying to encourage the plants, the seedlings, to maybe spread out and sucker within the row, but not necessarily sucker out towards the edge of the rows. And so I've started going to this method just to play with it a little bit, where it's two pieces, rectangular pieces on either side. Again, that open middle, trying to encourage new suckers to fill in. And that's a little bit different than years past where it's been a square with just a hole in the center. Because one of the other things that you have to keep in mind with the hole in the center is that you need to come back over time and cut that to make that larger, or you're actually going to choke off and girdle the plants, which we've seen time and time again if not managed properly. So weed barrier is not no maintenance. It does take a little bit of maintenance, but it does really help to keep the weeds down, especially when combined with something like the mulch on top of it. I think you can see in the corners, we use some pieces of wire to make some homemade stakes to just keep it in the ground. And we put stakes in all four corners and then on the two sides. So 2, 4, 5. There's 5 stakes in each one of these rectangles, so 10 total. Okay, tree tubes. The real benefit of tree tubes is protection from the wind and then pests. And when I say pests, I mean deer and rabbits, things like that. It does create a great microclimate. I mean, I really want to point that out. And you'll see that not only for how well the plants grow in there, but then how well the weeds can grow in there as well. And then the other thing to really keep in mind that these tree tubes are designed. They're not simply pieces of drainage pipe that we might see around trees. They're tree tubes and they're designed for a purpose. And I think I've got some video here. There we go. One of the things you can see is the holes. Those are vent holes that are made into the tree tube itself. And so that's a design type of a thing. You can see the translucency of the amount of light that's able to penetrate through the tree tube to allow photosynthesis to happen. We're going to pull up this tree tube here, and you can see the amazing growth that can be achieved within some of these tree tubes in just a year's time. And I think I pointed out here that this is almost all new growth. No, this one here, you can see how tall that plant was when we established it, when we put it in. That's probably 18 to 20 inches tall. It died back, perhaps winter kill. And what we're seeing there now is brand new growth from basically new growth from the root crown. So a new shoot that was put up. And so again, that's a great little microclimate for those plants to grow in. But again, it can also be a microclimate for other things to grow in as well. So it's important on the maintenance side of things. Here we have some purslane, and that all grew up and was starting to choke that seedling inside of that tree tube. And so a great microclimate for weeds and other things. So you have to go through and monitor from time to time, checking those tree tubes to see that there's not weeds growing up in there, choking the plants out. When you see the weeds coming up the top of the tree tube, that's when you know, ooh, I've screwed up and I need to get in there. And so we remove that purslane, and now that little seedling is going to really take off there. So. Okay, pruning. I want to touch on this briefly. Again, we're going to get back to what is the goal, and it really should be to remove dead and spent limbs or to remove those damaged or rubbing limbs. And then eventually you're going to want to maybe prune up some of those low growing branches. And there's a question of when to prune. And so while it might be great, like now even, or late fall after you're done harvesting, might be a great time for you to get out there and prune because you have the time and you can see the structure of the plant. I want to encourage you to remember that the male catkins are still on the plant. And so we don't want to be cutting out any stems that might have male catkins on them that would contribute to pollination. This video shows some damaged stems here from snow drifts. So the freeze thaw cycle of snow that gets drifted up in the hazelnuts. And incidentally, this year is going to be terrible because I have got some drifts that are 15, 16 feet high that are almost entirely throughout the entire hazelnut, not entire hazelnut planting, but a good maybe 1/10 of it where a big snowdrift came through. So we're going to see lots of damage. I'm going to have to get out there and do lots of pruning. Here's a really common thing where you have this rubbing, where you have one branch intersecting with the other. So we need to get in there and get that out of, we need to get in there and remove one of those. And so here we're going to make our cut. And you can see how that stem deformed around the other stem and grew around it. Just a real quick reminder to disinfect your tools with a little bleach solution if need be, or something like that, just so that you're not spreading disease within the orchard or certainly from orchard to orchard if you're doing any sort of a work at different locations. Just a little bit of hygiene goes a long way, certainly. Here's a great example of where that and again, this is competition. So that stem needed sunlight, so it started to grow almost straight out to access some of that sunlight. And then you have some of those other stems growing up around it and really causing a problem. So that's a great example of just needing to get in there and remove some of those rubbing branches so it doesn't lead to disease issues. You can kind of see in the center of the hazelnut shrub some nuts in there. And so sometimes the mice, the squirrels, the other things will make little nests and caches of nuts that you'll find in the center of the crown there. And so again, these are all reduction cuts to really address oh, so here's an interesting one where they've actually grown together, almost intertwined. And again, it's best if you can get these early, but even if it's now, we need to get in there and get them pruned out. Okay. You can see a lot of damage here again from some of those shrubs that were damaged by the snow. So it may be necessary to actually just take the entire thing out, essentially coppice the plant, remove everything so that we can let it grow right back up from the crown. And so in this particular case, we're just getting the chainsaw out and just the whole thing. We're going to lop it right down to the ground. And so this is going to hopefully rejuvenate the plant just a little bit, send up some of those new shoots. If we happen to have some invasives or some undesirable species in there, like mulberries or elms or volunteer ash trees, we would want to identify them, certainly mark them in some way, and then come through and treat them with maybe just a little bit of the um, chemical. It can be diluted Roundup, it can be any number of different products to treat a stem. Now, in this particular case, we're going to be doing some thinning. So that is to say, sunlight equals fruit. So if we have some plants that are getting choked out, we need to really open them up just a little bit. We want to go in there and reduce the overall size of the plant, but take out some of those older um, stems that are a little bit larger. And I'm breaking my own rule here because you'll see in just a moment, but we would ideally really want to do this after pollination. Again, we want to ensure good pollination, so we want to have all the available male catkins there as possible. And so if we go out there and we start doing some heavy pruning on some uh, uh, on some stems that have a whole bunch of male catkins on them, we're going to potentially be reducing then the pollen shed. And here's a great example. Look at all of those catkins on this particular. This is just two stems, just loaded with male catkins that potentially could have helped us with pollination in the spring. So ideally, we would wait till after pollination. Certainly, if you have some damaged stems that aren't going to open up and have pollination occur anyways, you can get in there after harvest over the winter and get those removed because it's not really going to impact things. And again, if you're taking out stems that don't have any of the male catkins on them, that's not going to be much of an issue as well. Um, and then here we do have just a volunteer that we want to cut out. And so we're just going to get the old loppers out and make a cut there and then treat that stem and before moving on. Trying to get as low and as close to the base as possible. And then just dauber on a little bit of, in this case, it's some diluted Roundup with just a little bit of food coloring in there. And again, we want to get that right on the outer edge, the cambium. That's the living part of the living tissue of the plant. That's what's going to take in the chemical and move it up and down the vascular system of the plant. And then we're just going to lop off some of those low hanging branches there, and off we go. Finally, just to kind of wrap up here, a little bit of orchard sanitation. After harvest, one of the things that we sometimes will do is just rake the rows to remove a lot of that leaf litter and some of those nuts and stuff like that. Again, if there's broken or damaged branches, oftentimes we'll remove those right away after harvest, just to make it easier to move in and out of the shrubs. And again, it's not going to hurt anything by removing them without those male catkins on them. And then sometimes we'll rake again in the spring just to get things cleaned up. And then again, reminding just to prune after pollination, ideally, so that we can get as much of that pollen out into the cloud in the spring when we need it. I wanted to point out a couple of resources that are available on the Upper Midwest Hazelnuts, the UMD website, Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative website. If you Google midwesthazelnuts.org, some really nice fact sheets and some information there. Again, we have these hazelnut resources, our Landowner's Guide to Perennial Crop Options on the Trees Forever website. Again, that midwesthazelnuts.org website, the Hazelnut Consortium, which is Arbor Day, Rutgers University, Oregon State University, and one of the programs working on hazelnuts in the Midwest here. And then a couple of things with the Iowa Nut Growers Association, certainly our YouTube page, where you'll be able to find a lot of these presentations actually that are recorded will go onto the YouTube page. Then we have the Iowa Hazelnut Project on Facebook, so check us out, search us out there. And then we do have the Iowa Nut Growers Association website, where you can get some additional information, including information on our upcoming nut evaluation. I'm sure you didn't believe it or didn't know it, but we actually, since the 1960s, have been scoring, evaluating, and judging nuts. And that'll be coming up here on Saturday, February 18th at Wiki Uphill Learning Center near Toddville. That's just north of Cedar Rapids. It's going to be a great time. And then we're also going to have a hazelnut learning group, specifically where we're going to hear for some growers on a panel. We're going to have Jim Fleming, who's someone who's actually making walking sticks out of hazelnut stems. And he's going to have a collection of some of his sticks there. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the need for a mobile processing unit. We already have the ability for some shared use on a husker. So we took the husker that we have up here, the Super Squirrel husker, we put it into a trailer so that it's mobile. We've taken it to some different places so that growers can get their nuts husked and to get to be nice round in shell nuts to be dried down. We want to talk about the next step of having an actual trailer that could be a licensed trailer that could do some cracking, sorting, sizing, some things like that. And then members could have access to it to kind of have a shared use cracking facility on wheels. So we'll be talking about that, and that'll be on February 18th. Our next session is going to be February 10th, harvesting and processing. No, I got that date wrong. It's going to be the 17th. Now, of course, today is the 10th, so apologize for that discrepancy there. Harvesting and processing, we'll be talking about that on Friday, February 17th at 6 p.m. Be there or be square. Okay, do we have any questions? Let's check the chat here and see what's going on there. Yes, planting even a quarter-inch too deep can be very bad, almost detrimental to plant health and difficult to fix later on, while planting 2 inches too high can easily be fixed with adding soil or mulch. So very easy for a plant to sink in a hole dug with the post hole digger. Thank you very much, Jeff. Spot on. That is excellent. And incidentally, that's what happened to me. So the property I live on now that I call Nut Haven, the former owner had somebody come in and plant some aronia berries, and that exact thing happened. They all dropped about an inch in the hole. They've subsequently been okay, but it definitely stunted them, put them back a little bit. And that's one of the things that we really harp on when we're planting trees and shrubs of any kind is don't plant too deep. It's an easy way to kill a tree or a shrub. So thanks for reinforcing that. And then, okay, timing of planting may be most important for establishment and growth. Too late in the spring or summer is very hard to get establishment going. And so great suggestions there. Love the double weed barrier spacing idea. Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. And then question is rotational coppicing every 10 years a recommended practice? I honestly don't know. That's one of the things that we need to figure out. So one of the early progenitors of or boosters of hazelnuts said, yeah, you should go in there and do a coppice every so often to rejuvenate the plant and stuff like that. Maybe that's the best way to go. Others have said that it takes, you do that coppice and you're not looking to get anything coming back for maybe 2 or 3 years. There's just no production. Some other fruits have some actual like pruning regimes, if I can use that term, where maybe they go in and they use a system of removing, 3 5-year-old stems and then coming in and removing 2 2-year-old stems. Um, Forgive me, I'm not in that world, but I just know enough to know that they do have some specific pruning regimes for some types of fruits and stuff like that. So that might be something that we look at with the hazelnuts is maybe we're not doing a complete coppice, but maybe a rejuvenation or just trying to thin the shrub out a little bit. And some of these shrubs, these experimental genotypes, some of them can sucker prolifically, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so keeping them in check can be a real challenge. So yeah, that's another point. And then somebody mentioned Tordon, and yes, so here is one of those things that I wish that I would have learned from another grower, because I made the mistake of utilizing Tordon and having the death halo where it certainly killed some of the invasive elms and mulberries that I had coming in, but it also killed some hazelnuts as well. And so yes, very good to bring up. Do not use Tordon. There's no reason to use that in an orchard setting at all. The diluted glyphosate is going to work just fine. And if you don't want to use any chemicals, you can continually cut back and weaken that plant. But it is nice to be able to treat that stem. It really does do a pretty good job. Um, Yeah. Jeff mentioned it's amazing how some of the genotypes sucker vigorously while others hardly at all. And that is really quite amazing. And incidentally, we have the Hazelnut Growers Conference coming up here on March 4th in Decorah. And I just finished up an interview because I wanted to provide some different perspectives for some growers maybe outside of the Midwest. And so I did an interview with a grower from West Virginia who's primarily growing the Oregon varieties, the European hazelnuts. And they do grow them as single trunks or single stemmed trees. And they do quite a bit of work keeping the suckers down with just a weed eater to knock off those suckers and stuff like that. So it's just amazing the different genotypes, the different cultivars, and then the production system that it kind of has to go with them and stuff like that. So any other questions? I feel like I've been rambling on here a little much, but you can use the chat. You can just chime in verbally if you'd like, whatever works for you. Well, I hope I provided just a little bit to clue you in terms of now that we've figured out the planning stages are over, or not really over, but what are we going to plant? That's really going to dictate kind of how we plant, whether it's going to be more labor intensive with the shovels, or we can get by with maybe using some of the transplanters or the tools like the little augers. Those are all decisions that are really going to boil down to what is your goal. And then, of course, that's going to dictate what your planting densities are. And once we get into it and stuff like that, and also then decisions on your weed management and watering and all those things. So next week, we're going to talk about harvesting and processing. So we're going to skip in time a little bit to now that you've got your plants in place, what happens in years 4 or 5 when we start to get some nuts, and we'll talk about some different size and scale things. So harvesting and processing next week at 6. Hope to see you all there. Have a great night, everyone.